The most important moments in any missing person investigation often comes down to something surprisingly ordinary. A phone call, a text message, brief exchange that seemed insignificant at the time, but later becomes part of a much larger timeline. In Nancy Guthrie's case, attention has recently focused on reports concerning the final known communications made before her disappearance. According to information discussed publicly, investigators have spent considerable time examining Nancy's phone activity during the hours leading up to the point where contact with her reportedly stopped. At first glance, that may not seem unusual. In almost every investigation involving a missing adult, digital communication becomes a major area of focus. Text messages can establish timelines, can identify relationships, they can reveal plans, concerns, disagreements, routine conversations that help investigators understand what was happening in the days and hours before someone vanished. Something doesn't fit. The public has spent years examining countless aspects of Nancy's disappearance. Questions surrounding her final communications continue to generate discussion. That alone suggests investigators may view those interactions as important pieces of a much larger puzzle. According to publicly available information, Nancy maintained regular contact with family members and people in her life. Like most people, she communicated through calls, messages, and routine conversations that formed part of her everyday schedule. Nothing about that fact stands out on its own. What matters is timing. Investigators frequently work backward from the last confirmed activity of a missing person. They establish where the person was seen, who spoke with them, what transactions occurred, and which communications can be verified through records. Once that timeline begins to take shape, certain details often receive greater scrutiny. Detail matters because timelines are rarely built around dramatic discoveries. More often, they are built around ordinary moments. Text message sent at a particular time, a phone call lasting only a few minutes, a response that arrived later than expected, conversation that suddenly stopped. Viewed in isolation, any one of those details may appear routine. Placed beside the broader timeline, however, they can become far more significant. Reports surrounding Nancy's case suggest investigators reviewed electronic records extensively. Authorities have not publicly released every detail. Investigators generally rely on phone records, cellular data, digital activity logs, witness statements when reconstructing a person's final known movements. Now consider this. If investigators identified a final known text exchange, the value of that information extends beyond the content of the message itself. The communication establishes a point in time. It confirms activity. It identifies another individual connected to the timeline. It creates a fixed reference point against which other evidence can be measured. That process is important because human memory is imperfect. Witnesses may remember events differently. People may disagree about exact times. Recollections can change as months and years pass. Digital records, however, often provide timestamps that help investigators compare statements against documented activity. Which raises another question. Did the final communications align with the timeline investigators believed to be accurate? Or did they introduce new questions? Publicly available information has not provided complete answers. Yet the continued interest surrounding Nancy's final communications suggests investigators considered them worthy of examination. Then something happened that often changes the direction of an investigation. Attention shifted from what was communicated to who was involved. Investigators routinely examine relationships connected to a missing person. Does not imply wrongdoing. It is simply standard investigative procedure. Family members, friends, acquaintances, business associates, and recent contacts may all become relevant when authorities attempt to establish a complete timeline. In many cases, individuals connected to those final communications possess information that helps clarify events. Sometimes they provide context. Sometimes they explain plans that investigators did not previously know about. Sometimes they help eliminate possibilities. And occasionally, their statements create additional questions. But something doesn't fit. Over time, several narratives emerged regarding what may have been occurring in Nancy's life before she disappeared. Some discussions focused on family dynamics. Others examined financial matters. Some centered on personal relationships. As investigators worked to evaluate information, separating verified facts from speculation became increasingly important. That challenge remains today. Public discussion often moves much faster than official investigations. Rumors spread quickly. Assumptions become repeated. Theories develop before evidence is fully examined. Investigators, however, must work differently. They compare records. They verify statements. They test timelines. They search for contradictions. And they attempt to determine whether individual pieces of information support or undermine existing conclusions. Placed beside that reality, the significance of any final communication becomes easier to understand. The message itself matters. The timing matters. The recipient matters. The surrounding circumstances matter. And perhaps most importantly, how those elements fit together matters. At first glance, a final text may appear to be a small detail. Investigators frequently view final communications as critical checkpoints. They help establish what was known, who was involved. Events occurred immediately before contact was lost. According to investigators in many missing person cases, those checkpoints often become some of the most reliable anchors in an otherwise uncertain timeline. As the examination of Nancy's final known communications continued, attention increasingly turned toward how those exchanges fit alongside witness statements, reported movements, and other evidence already collected during the investigation. It was that comparison process that began producing some of the most closely examined questions in the entire case. Because while certain details appeared consistent with the established timeline, other details reportedly proved far more difficult to reconcile. As investigators continued comparing communications against the established timeline, another issue began attracting attention. Timestamp by itself can confirm that a message was sent. What it cannot automatically explain is everything happening around that message. Distinction matters. A text exchange may establish contact between two people. Investigators still need to determine where those individuals were, what they were doing, whether their statements align with documented records, and whether other evidence supports the sequence of events being described. In Nancy Guthrie's case, publicly available information suggests authorities devoted significant effort to reconstructing the hours before her disappearance. That process reportedly involved reviewing digital records, witness accounts, and other information capable of helping investigators understand the final known movements associated with the timeline. Viewed in isolation, a final text message appears straightforward. Placed beside the broader investigation, however, it becomes only one component of a much larger evidentiary picture. Now consider this. When investigators examine communications, they rarely focus on a single message alone. They typically review conversations occurring before and after the communication in question. They examine patterns. They identify whether the exchange was routine or unusual. They look for interruptions, inconsistencies, behavioral changes that might help explain what happened next. That detail matters because context often determines significance. A message that appears ordinary on its own can take on a different meaning when compared against surrounding events. Conversely, a message that initially appears suspicious may ultimately prove completely unrelated once investigators obtain additional information. This is one reason experienced investigators tend to avoid drawing conclusions too quickly. The timeline comes first. The evidence comes next. Only then can theories be properly evaluated. But something doesn't fit. Throughout the years, numerous discussions surrounding Nancy's disappearance have focused on individual pieces of information rather than the complete timeline. Certain statements received attention. Certain relationships generated speculation. Certain events became the subject of intense public scrutiny. Investigations are rarely solved by examining a single detail in isolation. Instead, authorities attempt to determine whether multiple pieces of evidence point toward the same conclusion. That process appears especially relevant here. Investigators identified the final known recipient of a communication from Nancy, They would compare that information against other evidence already collected. They would review reported movements. They would examine schedules. They would analyze statements. They would attempt to determine whether every piece fits together logically. Even one component fails to align, additional questions often emerge. Which raises another question. Were there aspects of the timeline that investigators believed required further clarification? Publicly available information suggests authorities continued reviewing evidence long after the initial disappearance. That alone indicates investigators did not consider the case straightforward. Missing person investigations frequently evolve over time. New witnesses emerge. Existing witnesses remember additional details. Technology uncovers information that was previously inaccessible. Records are re-examined. Timelines are refined. As a result, details that initially appear insignificant can later become important. Then something happened that investigators often encounter in complex cases. The distinction between verified facts and public assumptions began growing wider. Authorities operate using evidence standards. Public often operates using incomplete information. As discussion surrounding Nancy's disappearance expanded, theories inevitably emerged attempting to explain events that investigators had not fully disclosed. Some focused on timing, others focused on relationships, others focused on communications. The challenge, however, remains the same. Theory may explain one detail while conflicting with 5 others. A timeline may appear convincing until additional evidence emerges. And a seemingly important clue may lose significance once investigators uncover more complete information. Reality is why professional investigators continuously test their own assumptions. At first glance, identifying a final communication seems like a major breakthrough. In practice, it is often the beginning of a more complicated analysis. Who received the message? What was discussed? What occurred afterward? Did subsequent actions align with the content of that communication? Did witness statements support the timeline? Did digital records confirm or contradict recollections? These are the kinds of questions investigators typically examine when evaluating final communications. Placed beside the broader investigation, however, another issue becomes increasingly important: opportunity. Investigators frequently analyze who had contact with a missing person during the final confirmed period before contact was lost. Again, this does not imply wrongdoing. It simply reflects standard investigative procedure. Authorities often seek to identify everyone connected to the timeline: who communicated with the individual, who saw them, who expected to hear from them, who reported unusual behavior, who provided information that could be independently verified. As those questions are answered, investigators gradually narrow areas of uncertainty. That process can take months, sometimes years, and in particularly difficult cases, even longer. Now consider this. One of the reasons final communications attract so much attention is because they frequently represent the last documented evidence that a person's actions were normal and voluntary. Everything occurring after that point becomes increasingly important. Investigators, therefore, pay close attention to any gap that follows: missed call, an unanswered message, a planned meeting that never occurred, a routine activity that suddenly stopped. These events can help establish when something changed. And, according to publicly available discussions surrounding Nancy's disappearance, determining exactly when that change occurred appears to have remained a significant focus of the investigation. Because once authorities establish that moment with confidence, they can begin concentrating their efforts on the events immediately surrounding it. And as investigators continued comparing communications, witness accounts, and documented activity, attention increasingly centered on several timeline details that appeared consistent on the surface but became far more complicated once examined, alongside the rest of the evidence. As investigators continued examining the timeline, one reality became increasingly difficult to avoid. Even if authorities were able to identify the final known recipient of a message from Nancy Guthrie, that information alone could not explain what happened afterward. A timeline is not built from a single event. It is built from a chain of events. Chain includes communications, movements, witness observations, digital activity, financial records, reported interactions, every verifiable detail investigators can place into chronological order. By itself, a final text message means very little. When placed beside the rest of the evidence, its significance can change dramatically. That detail matters because investigators are not simply interested in who received a message. They are interested in what happened next. Did Nancy continue communicating? Did her normal routines continue? Did anyone report speaking with her afterward? Did her phone remain active? Did records show additional activity? Or did the timeline begin showing signs that something was wrong? These are the questions investigators typically ask when evaluating the final confirmed period before a disappearance. Now consider this. In many missing person cases, the most important clues are not necessarily the final communications themselves. Sometimes the most revealing information comes from what fails to happen afterward. A person who normally responds suddenly stops responding. Routine appointment is missed. A planned meeting never occurs. A daily habit abruptly ends. Viewed in isolation, each event may appear ordinary. Combined together, however, they can indicate the point where investigators should focus their attention. Publicly available information suggests authorities spent considerable effort identifying exactly where that transition may have occurred in Nancy's case. That process is often more difficult than many people realize. Witnesses may remember events differently. Timelines may shift as new information emerges. Records sometimes clarify details that were initially misunderstood. As a result, investigators frequently revisit evidence multiple times. But something doesn't fit. Over the years, public discussion surrounding Nancy's disappearance has often focused on individual theories. Certain people have been scrutinized. Certain statements have been analyzed repeatedly. Certain events have been interpreted through competing narratives. Investigators generally approach cases differently. Rather than asking whether a theory sounds convincing, they ask whether evidence supports it. Distinction is critical. A theory can appear persuasive while lacking supporting evidence. Conversely, evidence can point investigators in directions the public never expected. That is why timelines remain so important. Timelines are difficult to manipulate. Digital records do not usually care about theories. Phone records do not care about speculation. Financial transactions do not care about assumptions. They simply document activity. And when investigators compare those records against statements and witness accounts, inconsistencies can become easier to identify. Placed beside the broader investigation, the discussion surrounding Nancy's final communications appears significant for precisely that reason. The communication itself may be important. The timing may be important. The surrounding circumstances may be important. Investigators are ultimately concerned with how those details connect to everything else they know. Then something happened that often shapes long-term investigations. The absence of definitive public answers created additional uncertainty. Years after a disappearance, people naturally search for explanations. They revisit old evidence. They examine new information. They compare competing interpretations. The challenge is that unresolved questions sometimes remain unresolved because investigators themselves are still attempting to answer them. That appears to be one reason interest in Nancy's case continues. Several important questions remain difficult to answer using publicly available information alone. Exactly occurred during the final verified period before contact was lost? Did every witness statement align with documented evidence? There are details known to investigators that have never been publicly disclosed. Did certain pieces of evidence carry greater significance than observers realized at the time? Those questions continue to attract attention because they sit near the center of the investigation itself. At first glance, identifying a final communication may appear to provide a clear path toward resolution. In reality, it often marks the point where investigators begin asking even more detailed questions. Who else was contacted? Events occurred immediately afterward. Did subsequent activity support the established timeline? There are contradictions requiring additional examination. And were there pieces of information that only became significant once viewed alongside newer evidence? Those questions remain central to understanding what investigators have been attempting to reconstruct. Publicly available information does not provide definitive answers to every aspect of Nancy Guthrie's disappearance. Does provide is a picture of an investigation built around timelines, communications, witness accounts, and evidence gathered over an extended period of time. The reported focus on Nancy's final communications reflects a broader investigative reality. Authorities often begin with the last confirmed activity they can verify and work outward from there. Every message, every interaction, every documented movement becomes another point on the timeline. Some details eventually prove unimportant. Others become critical. Determining which is which requires evidence rather than assumptions. For now, the available information suggests investigators considered the final known period before Nancy's disappearance important enough to examine closely. Whether those communications ultimately provide answers remains unclear. Clear is that they represent one piece of a much larger effort to understand what happened and why. If you've been following this case, let me know in the comments which piece of evidence you believe deserves the closest examination. Here at the Evidence Room, we follow the facts, examine the timeline, and track every development as investigators continue searching for answers. If you haven't already, subscribe and turn on notifications so you don't miss future investigations.